We are most fully human when we're connected to one another. And we rise to our full potential when we find our voice. But what we really do is find our strength when we join our voices with others, speaking out in a unified voice. Unless we begin to do this and come together, we are not only not going to be heard, we're not even going to be listened to and taken seriously. So, providing a place in cyberspace to bring all these voices together from all around the world and find our purpose. This is our purpose at Catholic Church Reform International and why we are introducing our next speaker. It's our hope that each one of us will be inspired through this conference to find our voice, to deepen our conviction on a cause that matters to us, truly matters. So here this afternoon is a woman whose life work has been helping students from all over the world find their voice. And in working with women across the religious spectrum, she's learned that not only Roman Catholics, but women of all religious faiths share a common experience of being suppressed, degraded, and treated less than human in their respective churches. Ladies, it is time to stop this from happening. So here, to address the issue of finding our voice and joining with others, speaking courageously with one strong voice, is our next speaker. Please help me welcome Dr. Ursula King.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and I thank VOW most warmly for inviting me to speak to you, even though I feel very frustrated to speak only for a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. But at least I can give you an inkling of what I want to say, because speaking out with one voice, as Catholic Church Reform International is also trying to do among Christians, we could say there is an attempt to speak out with one voice among the different faiths, and that will be reflected tonight in the interfaith panel. Equal in faith, the women have very similar problems and very similar struggles, as Renee has very kindly just pointed out. So there's a new situation where you feel that, where you can discover when you travel around the world, that women in all faiths, whether it is Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, all the different faiths and many other faiths, you have a similar awareness, modern awareness of women coming to realize that their position, that their place, their role in their respective faith communities has often been a secondary one, and that their own experiences and spiritual insights have not been given the importance that those of the man has been given. So we're in a new situation, and I think we are connecting in a new way. We are really in a new evolutionary stage where women of different faiths are finding their own voice. And this is a Buddhist woman from Sri Lanka has called this or described this as a silent revolution taking place. And when you study the different faith traditions, you realize how revolutionary it is. Women have really become, in a very active way, change agents, as Mary Hunt named them yesterday, change agents. And that's a very exciting moment for us to take note of and to participate in. Now, I want to, as some of you here know of some of my works on women and religion, and also I've written a great deal on the French mystic and scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, I want to quote from him a very prophetic phrase, a sentence he wrote to one of his priest friends in October 1929, so that's almost 100 years ago, where he says, It sometimes seems to me that there are three perishable stones sitting dangerously in the foundations of the modern church. First, a government which excludes democracy. We heard about this earlier in the day. Second, a priesthood, and you'll be interested in this, a priesthood which excludes and minimizes women. That was in 1929. So it's not just from yesterday, all this conscientization and awareness of women's possible priesthood and what women will contribute. Third, a revelation which excludes prophecy for the future. We are really talking about the future, how the human species, how we as individuals and as a human group around the earth will move forward, will evolve further, going upward and forward. That is really very important. Now, we know women of exceptional wisdom and faith in all the faith traditions, but when you look at the past, if you look at Christian saints or whether you look at Hindu women or Buddhist women or Jewish women, these exceptional women were given little spiritual authority in their communities. They were not really taken full cognizance of. And this is something new, therefore, that in the human species now, we have come to a moment where I think there is a revolutionary process of transformation taking place, which a Pakistani Muslim scholar has described, a woman scholar has described as the gendering of the spirit. And that is really, truly a new development in human history. I very much like Thomas Barry's suggestions that at this important juncture in the development of a new Earth consciousness and a new Earth community, the wisdom of women is one of the important resources for the further evolution of humankind. Feminism and all its achievements play a great part in this, and so do the irreplaceable resources of faith, of our global spiritual and religious heritage that we possess, for the human community to be energized and transformed by. That's very, very important, because besides all the material energy resources that we need to run society and to run our economy, we have to ask ourselves, as Teya did many years ago, where do our spiritual energy resources come from? Where are the most precious resources for our own further development as a human community? How can we come together and really enrich each other and develop things, develop our spirituality, develop our community action together, inspired by great ideals that are so deeply enshrined in our religious traditions? So it's not just only Christian women who have found so many resources in their own traditions, but you can find it among Muslim women, Jewish women, Hindu and Buddhist women, as I've already said. And they have to come together. Many women in these different communities are, like you, actively engaged in peacemaking, in educational, developmental and environmental work. So their passionate commitment can truly be called a dialogue of hands, head, and heart, as some people speak about. Interfaith dialogue is really, truly a dialogue of hands, of working together, of head, thinking together, and of heart, being drawn to each other, loving each other, working together, collaborating. Now, what I want to point out in the very brief time that I have, I would like to say that the historical roots for these are not just the modern women's movement since the 1960s or even since 1900. This starts after the Enlightenment, and it is particularly visible in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, where you have 1893, the Parliament for World Religions in Chicago was a real breakthrough, even though no Roman Catholics took part and no Jewish women took part. But of the 200 plenary addresses that were given to audiences as large as 2,000 to 3,000 people in Chicago, 19 addresses, plenary addresses, were given by very inspired and very actively involved women, and the participants of the Chicago Parliament saw this as a new dawn, the coming of women, and women taking their full place, and women contributing their important share to the future spiritual development of humanity. Now, it's very interesting that of those 19 women, I think it was 7 who were already ordained. The first woman to be ordained in the United States in the Free Churches in Harlem was Reverend Antoinette Blackwell Brown, and that happened in 1853. So by 1893, she had worked as a minister for 40 years, and that's what she talks about. Woman speaking from a pulpit. What is it like to be a minister for 40 years? She became a minister at the age of 28. She married, she had 6 daughters, and one of the little girls once asked whether there could be male priests, because she had only ever seen her mother perform rites in church. So you can see how we are dependent on our context and on the psychological examples. Are there any male priests? Well, let's see whether there are. These were the women priests. And by 1921, when Reverend Antoinette Blackwell Brown died, there were 3,000 ordained women in the free churches in the USA. I mean, historical work has been done. Then I could speak about Florence Nightingale, who didn't come to really found a hospital and look after the soldiers, but her main purpose was to organize a new religion. She's really a radical theologian, and when you read her theological writings, you'll see how much she is a feminist. Then you can say, in the 20th century, you have much more coming together, like MOC was founded 40 years ago. St. John's International Alliance was founded in 1911, started with the suffragette movement. But then you have, in the late 20th century, in 1986, you have the European Federation of Women in Theological Research. And almost the same year, or the next year, in 1987, the Buddhist Global Women's Movement starts, the movement that some of you will know, Shakyadita, the daughters of the Buddha, and they are also concerned with changing women's place in religion. So you get a lot of people involved in this. When Vivekananda spoke at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, he went home, he founded the Ramakrishna Mission. Now, he wanted to also found a women's order, but his society at that time was not ready for it. So you have the Sarada Devi, his wife, became the model for the women, and you have the sisters only being founded as communities after 1954, after Indian independence. So it's basically in the 20th century. And in the tradition, in Hinduism traditionally, you could not have women ascetics. You didn't have nuns in Hinduism. You don't have sannyasinis. That was really a male Brahminical prerogative. But now you have quite a lot of women ascetics, and you have many women gurus, which is a real innovation. I wrote about this in 1984 when there was very little literature and there were very few women gurus. Now you should see the American women scholars, they write whole books on the women gurus because it has spread like fire. Suddenly so many women are inspired, and this comes about with the women being educated, learning to read and write and learning the meaning of that text and being able to recite these texts, because traditionally in Hinduism and Buddhism, as you will know, what is very important is to recite the sutras, to recite the text. And women were not allowed to do this. They had no access to these texts. It was it was absolutely forbidden for them to recite texts. So this is a modern breakthrough. It's a real revolution, right? So that makes a huge difference. Now, similarly, in Islam, how the women now study and can study the Quran much more than they could in the past. This is a new development. Now, what is very interesting, and you may not know about this, and very few Muslims know about this. In Islam in China, the Muslims in China are in Central Asia, and they are the Hui Muslims. It's a particular ethnic group. There are about 18 million of them, and they have had women imams since 1600. So they get, and most people don't know this at all. I didn't know this until about 15 years ago. And they have had their own women mosques. And you get oral histories of families where there have been 15 generations of women imams in the family. Because the women imams are very often married to the male imams. But the women have their own mosques. But now the women even teach, some of the women imams teach both men and women together. It's an absolutely revolutionary development. Now, some of the Chinese Muslims get money from the Middle East, and they are told by Arabs in the Middle East, this is not Islamic, you can't do this, this is an innovation. And the Chinese women say, wait a minute, the Chinese communities say, we have had these women imams since 1600. Islam would never have got established in China if we not had both male and female imams. And moreover, we have had a communist regime, and Mao Zedong has liberated women. Our women are liberated, and they're women imams and women mosques, and they're going to stay there, you see? So you get a very interesting tension between tradition and modernity. I only wanted to mention this because most of you will not know about this. You may know more about the World Council of Churches decade from 1988 to 1998. There was a decade of churches in solidarity with women. And at the centenary of the Chicago Parliament of Religions in 1993, some friends of mine and myself, we tried to organize a petition which we got hundreds of people to sign for the parliament to call it, because there were many religious leaders at the parliament, to create a decade of religions in solidarity with women. But I mean, they were too much hung up. I mean, they were so occupied to pass Hans Küng's declaration on the global ethic that we never came to the women. So this has not happened. They tried it again at the Barcelona Parliament in 2004, and it wasn't successful either. So, women still have a long, long way to go. And the global Buddhist women's movement, if I can just say a few things about that. Some of you may be acquainted with the differences in Buddhism, the Southern Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism, the Buddhism of the elders, and Mahayana Buddhism in China and in Northern Asia. So the lineage, in Buddhism, unlike in Islam, in Buddhism you have nuns communities since the beginnings of Buddhism, but then the nuns were always in an inferior position to the monks. The monk, however learned a nun was, she never had the same position as a male monk. So there has been a great deal of tension, and in Sri Lanka especially, the ordination of nuns got lost for reasons that are not entirely clear in about the 10th century. The male ordination was reestablished at a period of strife, but the women never got their ordination back. So they have, in the 20th century, struggled to get their ordination back. And this has been successful up to a point, but it is resisted by some of the abbots and the monks. I was in Sri Lanka in 1981 when this women's movement among the nuns started, and they were very keen to get this back. And 10 years later, 15 years later, they got the ordination back. But when you see the arguments and the battles, it's very similar to the battles about priesthood in the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, I can't give you all the statistics and the differences between the nuns and the monks because there's so much happening. I mean, and there are wonderful documentary films about this I could tell you about. In Taiwan, for example, over 60% of all ordained Buddhists are women. In other words, unlike in other Buddhist countries, there are more women Buddhist nuns than there are monks. And the women are very empowered, and they take up a great deal of learning, positions in teaching, not only in the monasteries, but also in the universities. And that's a very interesting situation to experience. Now, much has been written on Islam and gender, especially by secular Muslim feminists, but the complexity of attitudes towards rereading of classical religious texts, which is problematic in all the faiths, but where we all have to do a lot of work, but there is an ambiguity and there's a battle between secular Muslim Islamist and Islamist feminists in different Islamic countries, and you have to look country by country. But a particularly interesting country is Indonesia, the country with the largest Muslim population in the world, where thousands of institutions exist to train both women and men to become specialists in Islamic knowledge. And so one scholar has written about rereading the Quran. By rereading the Quran, like women read the Bible in Christianity, women are shaping Islam in a new way. And I could give you many examples about this, but perhaps Asra Nomani, who's coming here and who has written very interestingly about her own experience of being a Muslim, of going to Mecca and so on, maybe she'll talk about this. I could give you many, many examples, but I can't actually do this. I want to just come to some concluding remarks. And these are about spiritual literacy. You see, already at the 1893 World Parliament of Religions, women were very conscious that they had to learn the classical languages, in our case, Hebrew and Greek and Latin, to read all the text and become as learned as the men, whether they were ordained or not ordained, whether they're monks or scholars, but they had to achieve a literacy which was not only a literacy about the text, but a literacy which one can describe as a spiritual literacy, so that women become teachers with authority, because they have the learning, they have the reflection, they have the analysis. And this is something which is, for the first time in human history, you can say that a growing number of women from different religious and secular backgrounds are articulating their own spiritual experiences in a very new way. This has not happened just among certain particular individuals, like we have some women saints or some women doctors of the church. No, it is happening to women as a group around the globe. This is a social phenomenon, not an individual phenomenon, but a social phenomenon which is spreading over the entire planet. And it is in that sense a radically new development which will have a profound impact on the future of religion and spirituality and on the human species as a whole. So what I want to say is that education and literacy opens up hitherto unknown pathways to the life of the spirit for women in a way that was for most women not possible in the past. They produce an empowering spiritual literacy through which, in a moment of critical self-reflexivity, emerges a turn to become actively engaged with their faith and tradition, so that it's not just the reading and studying and meditating sacred literature in the light of contemporary experience, but women doing that become also cultural critics, activists, reformers, shaping their own lives and that of their communities. So the social activism and engagement, which is rooted in a spirituality of engagement for life, is particularly visible among many Asian women who are nourished by their faith traditions, in this case particularly Buddhism and Hinduism. There are over 300 million Buddhist women in the world, and only 1% of those are Western women who have become Buddhists. The most of the Buddhist women live in the East, and they need education. They need education. One Tibetan nun has said, very educated Tibetan nun has said, women without education are like birds without wings. They can't fly. You need to have education to become free and to fly. So it's important worldwide, across the faith traditions, to widen the access to foundational religious texts for women in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. And I want to conclude by saying this is as radical an act as it was when the Christian Bible was first translated into vernacular languages in Europe. This happened in the 16th century. A radical act that was widely protested and resisted by the scholars, and over which some people lost their lives. And you have a similar situation now in the other phase, and that's very, very important to realize. Women's open access to the scriptures of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam represents a similar revolution which has only just started and whose outcome is by no means certain. So we can say that countless women, not just only women, Catholic women who seek ordination, or Christian women, or Jewish women who become rabbis, particularly in the Reformed tradition, but countless women from different religious faiths are articulating today spiritual readings and choices that will have a profoundly transformative effect on themselves, on others, and on their faith. The rich diversity of women's redefinition of spirit and spirituality represents a global movement which is pregnant with promise and hope, not only for women in Asia and the West, but for the entire world. Thank you. I've been too long.